Good evening. I'm Henry Neufeld, and this is my Thursday night Bible study on my YouTube channel. Let's invite the Lord to be with us. Lord, I thank you for today. I thank you for your blessings, for your strength and your guidance, and I pray that your Holy Spirit will be with us to lead us into whatever truth it is that you have for us this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, this is going to be an interesting one. I'm starting a verse by verse with the book of Daniel. And one of the interesting things in studying the book of Daniel is simply that it's complicated. I have a number of books actually opened around me and a number of books to show you, talking a little bit about the resources we're using, but I mostly want to be starting in on the text of Daniel and bring in introductory material and history as we look at the text. We often start with lengthy introductions, and I already have in talking about eschatology. What is eschatology all about, and laying the groundwork? And I'm going to hold up here first the book Eschatology by Dr. Edward Vick. Eschatology, a participatory study guide, lays out some of the shall I say, maps out the landscape of eschatology so that we can understand the terminology and most especially realize that there are a number of different ways in which these passages are interpreted, the way they're combined, the way they're understood. The fundamental thing, and I get this from Dr. Vick, he says similar things in both his book on eschatology and his book, Creation, the Christian Doctrine. What is it that makes a doctrine Christian? And what makes a doctrine Christian is being Christ-centered. Now, a lot of times we say this is the Christian doctrine because we spent a lot of time quoting Bible texts. But if we manage to quote a lot of Bible texts and yet we don't make the doctrine Christ-centered, it can't really be called a Christian doctrine. And in eschatology, we're also looking at the fact that Christians have disagreed dramatically on the issue of end times. On just about every point that we can bring up, Christians have disagreed in very major ways. The areas of agreement are only in a very broad outline of what we're talking about. And that's why I spent the time laying out kind of a map of the landscape. So now as we're reading texts, we go, how does this apply? How did this text feed into the various views on eschatology that there are out there? And how can this text guide me? How did it guide people in the past? How can this text guide me? And in order to do that, as I approach the book of Daniel, I want to look at the whole text. Now, before I take another step in that direction, let me just say, on the showcase tonight, I've put a couple of things. There's, as always, link to my YouTube page and for subscribing to the YouTube channel that I use for these Bible studies, and also my Google Plus page to follow. All of these are announced both on Google Plus and also on the YouTube channel. Both of those are available. But then I've created a resources page specifically for dating and for introductory issues to the book of Daniel. The link is there. Resources for dating the book of Daniel. It's in also in the showcase. If you're on YouTube, you have to use the banner that says to join the conversation that should be across your screen as you do that. So that's resources for dating the book of Daniel. And finally, I've made a link again to Dr. Vick's book, Eschatology, a Participatory Study Guide. So, and included on the resource page is a video, a YouTube video that I made this afternoon talking about the view of the book. How does how is the dating to be established? What are the various views, and what do they mean for interpretation? Be worthwhile to read that. What I want to say here is that as I go through here, I'm going to look at multiple options for issues such as the literary unity of the book, literary unity meaning written essentially together at one time, intended as one work, versus a collection, multiple authors, that sort of thing, and the dating for the book of Daniel. This is more fully explained in the video I made this afternoon. Dating for the book of Daniel ranges from the 6th century, really the very, very, very late 7th century for the start of the story, but the writing sometime in the latter half of the 6th century, all the way to a complete, essentially a book completely constructed in the 2nd century at the time of the Maccabees. For Protestants, not having the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees in our Bibles, which I think is unfortunate, we don't really know that second period of history. We think of this as kind of a long period of silence, but there is material on that. If you haven't read them before, I do recommend reading the books of Maccabees. 1st Maccabees is a more historical account. 2nd Maccabees is a very heavily spiritual, miraculous kind of account in the character. So those are both worthwhile, and those come from the latter period at which the book is dated. Now, most of that probably, if you haven't spent time reading introductions in your study Bibles or articles in Bible dictionaries, or possibly even commentaries on the book of Daniel, that may be covering a lot of unfamiliar ground. And that's why I want to go verse by verse first. We're going to go right into the book, and some of the issues that are involved in the dating and the unity are going to show up. Now, I'm going to bring up here, pardon me for looking around, but I have like 6 stacks of books to talk about here. I'm bringing up the Revised English Bible. I'm going to be consulting with the Hebrew and Aramaic texts. We'll talk about Daniel's written in 2 languages. I have it open here, but I'm not going to be trying to translate on the fly. There are many words that we could just discuss the details. Now, a little bit about the background. You know, I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist. Seventh-day Adventists are very involved with eschatology, and their eschatology is very much involved with the books of Daniel and Revelation. It's important to understand that who I am and my experience and my history has something to do with how I understand this, even though probably in this area is probably the key, it's the key area where I would say that I now differ from what I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist. Seventh-day Adventists will come to this in Daniel 8. Daniel 8:14 is a very key text, which I understand almost completely differently, almost no relationship in the way I would understand it and the way I learned it as a Seventh-day Adventist. Let me hold up here a couple of books. On the resources page and on the pages linked from it, I'll have that. But you know, we grew up here. I think if I have any Seventh-day Adventist viewers, you probably recognize the Treasures of Life by Uriah Smith, Daniel and the Revelation. And I was looking through here today and finding cards and highlighting all through it that I read it as a young person. Now, there's a very strong emphasis there on moving to the prophetic material. We tended to read Daniel 2, which is a vision, or it really isn't a vision, it's a story with a vision embedded in it. Daniel 7, which is a vision, and then you have all of the prophetic material of Daniel's 8 through 12. And so that I was quite used to, so I thought I'd kind of hold that one up here. But a lot of transition that I had, and you'll be able to find this. I have a link again in the blog post on dating the book of Revelation that I wrote about 10 years ago, includes a link to this book, Daniel. That's Daniel written in Hebrew characters by Desmond Ford. This was published in the Anvil Biblical Studies series by an Adventist publisher, no longer in print. As a matter of fact, that publisher no longer exists, but there have been related materials by Desmond Ford. He put out the apotelesmatic principle. Don't worry too much about the long name, but what it suggested essentially was that prophecies have embedded in them multiple fulfillments. That is to say, that a prophecy can, as when uttered, apply to many different potential time periods, so that you could have a prophecy in Daniel that, say, applied to the period of the Maccabees 400 years later, and also, say, applied to modern times or to the future and the time of the Second Advent. If you go kind of to the other line, when I was in graduate school, this is the first time I ventured outside of that kind of school. Daniel by Norman W. Porteous in the Old Testament Library series. These books could not be really more, the book could not be more opposite from what I grew up with on this, teaching the later dating. And as you go in through this material, the book that I'll be reading the Bible translation from this Oxford Study Bible. In this introduction, essentially, the idea of an early dating, of 6th century dating, which is kind of the structure in the book itself, is completely dismissed. Similarly, and I like to use multiple study Bibles. Let me put that in here. Use multiple study Bibles. Here, New Interpreter's Study Bible. This is an excellent one if you're interested in doing theological thinking. New Interpreter Study Bibles built around the New Revised Standard Version. Again, a little less dismissive than the Oxford Study Bible, but nonetheless pretty much dismisses the early dating. Then here is the NLT Study Bible, which says that essentially it's got to be written early and is very dismissive of any kind of later dating. So I like reading those things side by side, and all of these are written on a pretty reasonable layman's level. They don't require you to be an expert in biblical studies in order to follow what they're saying. So let's just start in here and look at the book of Daniel. I'll probably be picking up some of the books that I just laid aside after showing them to you, just to give you an idea. And there are more commentaries that are listed in the resource page and in the pages linked from those pages. And I will expand that resource page as time goes on, if I either write more material or find more of the material that I've written previously. If we start here in Daniel, we'll jump right into the issues. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, came and laid siege to Jerusalem. Dating-wise, several of the commentaries are going to point out a lot of the problems. One of these is that it looks like Nebuchadnezzar arrived at Jerusalem approximately 605, or he took action against, he had won against the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish, brought Syria and Judah then into his empire, and this would have been 605. And Jehoiakim began to reign in 609. 3rd year, we're talking 607, 606. Now, none of these dates are quite absolute, although the ones for Nebuchadnezzar are pretty good because we have them tied for the most part to astronomical events. But you have a bit of a chronological discrepancy there. how seriously you take that, because you're talking months that could change it, depends on, depends on how shall I say, how vigorously you think that the chronology was written. Now, if we have some sort of historical fiction, it's probably done more loosely, but these numbers are very close. A more serious problem that's brought up here: Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian king, came and laid siege to Jerusalem. The Lord handed Jerusalem, King Jehoiakim, over to him, together with all that was left of the vessels from the house of God, and he carried them off to the land of Shinar, to the temple of his God, where he placed the vessels in the temple treasury. Okay, this brings in the second historical problem at this point, which is that this is a portrayal, the rest of the vessels, that sounds more like one of the later sieges. Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem after Jehoiakim had reigned. That's why Jehoiakim only reigned for 3 months. Zedekiah then reigned for another 11 years, and then we have the final exile of 586, which is when you would normally say the rest of the vessels were taken. There isn't, in fact, any record of exiles being taken in 605 BC at all. But it's not entirely impossible that exiles were taken at a point where Jehoiakim had become a tributary of Egypt. As a matter of fact, Pharaoh Necho, who had killed Josiah, Jehoiakim's father, in battle on the way to fight King Nebuchadnezzar, placed Jehoiakim on the throne in place of his brother Jehoiahaz. So at that point, Judah was tributary to Egypt, but when Pharaoh Necho met Nebuchadnezzar at Carchemish, he lost. Eventually, this led to the conquest of Syria. Now, you're talking here very close issues of chronology. And so the exact accession date here may be, an interesting question. And also, how much is considered, is the accession year, let's say if somebody, using our modern years, if somebody began to reign as a king in December of one year, do you call that his first year, or do you call the first full year his first year? And ancient sources differ on that. What I'm saying here in general is that this introduction doesn't fit nicely with the historical material, and that's why it's quite debatable. When people say that the conclusions are absolute, I have to question it, because there are always places where these things could fit. But realize here that we're only at this point 2 verses into the book of Daniel, and you'll see why, from what I've just said, you can probably see why Daniel gets disputed, because of all these kinds of issues. Now, let's get off of that kind of dispute, because we're not really going to settle it right now, and unless we all want to sit down and draw chronological charts from Josiah on through the end, we're probably not going to be highly successful. Incidentally, just the accession year of 609 versus a 605 battle is a kind of an interesting thing, based on the sources that we're reading. So, leaving aside that whole little several year period, and let's turn to the second thing here that I think we need to watch, is this taking the vessels and putting them in the house of his God. We're now off of the historical issue and on to the issue of how one kingdom treated another and how they thought of gods. This was a problem for Judaism, because typically if you lost in the ancient Near East, if you lost a war, it was taken by most people as a sign that your gods were weaker than the invaders' gods. So here comes Nebuchadnezzar. He takes the temples and the vessels out of the temple, takes them back to Babylon, which is his land of Shinar, which is just interesting terminology there itself, which feeds into dating, to the temple of his God, and he puts these vessels into his temple treasury. This is to say, my God's stronger than your God. I came and I won the war. I'm in charge. Now, what is expected then is that you may keep your gods in some way, but you're going to acknowledge the supremacy of the invaders' gods. And when the Jews failed to do this at various times, it was pretty astonishing behavior. It was expected that you bow down to the gods of the person who had conquered you, because this is just, he has demonstrated his superiority. It was being obtuse not to understand that he was now in charge, and so therefore you bow down to his gods. This was a much easier viewpoint for somebody who was a polytheist. So we're setting up this kind of tension right here. The king of Babylon has conquered Judah, and his gods are better. That's the line that we have so far in the book. Now we're going to talk about Daniel as apocalyptic literature, but first we're going into these stories. What these stories are doing is setting up the scenario for apocalyptic. Apocalyptic literature grows out of a crisis situation. An Israelite reading this, whether I suggest it is written at the time of the exile or all the way down to the 2nd century and the time when Antiochus Epiphanes is again saying the same thing. I conquered you. We're going to take over the temple in Jerusalem, and we're going to offer sacrifices to our gods there in your temple, which is our right because we're stronger than you are. Whatever of these places you're at, you're going to have the Jews saying, no, there's only one God, and we worship this one and only God. So you have this contrast, this fight. Now, Jewish monotheism was only firmly entrenched through the exile, so you would probably also, in this case, have a certain number of the Jewish exiles who would be saying, we agree it's okay, there are other gods, and we're in Babylon, it belongs to them. In this case, when in Babylon, do as the Babylonians do and worship their God. So this is the tension of the book is set up right here. This is the crisis. The Babylonian gods appear to be in charge. They're superior over the God of Israel because they have taken these people into exile. The Jews saw this differently, but that's nonetheless how the tension is created. So the king, speaking now, of course, of Nebuchadnezzar as opposed to Jehoiakim, who is just also a king just mentioned, the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring into the palace some of the Israelite exiles, members of their royal house and of the nobility. They were to be young men free from physical defect, handsome in appearance, at home in all branches of knowledge, well-informed, intelligent, and so fitted for service in the royal court. And he was to instruct them in the writings and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily allowance of fine food and wine from the royal table, and their training was to last for 3 years. At the end of that time, they would enter his service. Among them were certain Jews. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the master of the eunuchs gave new names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah Shadrach, Mishael Meshach, and Azariah Abednego. Now, what is going on here, of course, is we're going to take the nobility of this foreign country and we're going to assimilate them into our language and culture. In some cases, people like this could then be used as officials elsewhere in the empire or back or even back home, although as we know that within a few years after this, depending on how you look at the exile involved here, the people would be taken into exile. And Judea would be left essentially a waste. They're renamed to take away their identity as with their Jewish names, so they're given Babylonian names. This is again building on the tension by changing their names and the identity. You know, Daniel is God is judge. Hananiah, God will show mercy, so on. It's the God or the name Yahweh is included, shortened form included in all of these names, and those are taken away and they're given these Babylonian names. As just a side note here, becoming instructed in all of the language and the learning of the or the writing and the language of the Chaldeans, that's cuneiform. And that is no small task. Having been there myself in graduate school and studied Akkadian, that's Akkadian with two Ks, people down here on the Gulf Coast think of Akkadian with two Cs, which is over, the French-based culture and over toward New Orleans, but we're talking about Akkadian with two Ks from the old kingdom of Akkad, which the same language then was both the language of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And you used both syllabic signs and signs that represented words. You were into the hundreds simply to learn the basics, and of course into thousands of signs for a more general writing. So it was not a very easy task that these young people were set about. Conquerors have known what was going on here for years. This afternoon, I was listening to the Paul Revere and the Raiders, Cherokee Nation, putting the children into a school, teaching English, taking away their language, taking away their way of life. What this is how you reduce people. You may not be killing their bodies, but you're taking away their identities, who they are and their history, and trying to replace it with yours. In one way, this early part of the story of Daniel is a story of imperialism and how it functions. We grab the people, we grab their religious objects, we take them to our country, we put their religious objects in our temple instead of theirs, we take their best young people and put them in our court, give them our food according to our plan, we train them with our language, and we by that means take away their identity as whoever they are, in this case their identity as Israelites. I don't think you should really use the term Jew until after the exile. Judeans, at this point, you take that all away from them and you say, you are now going to, in effect, be Babylonians. We're remaking you into new people based on our heritage. And people with imperial ambitions have done this through the millennia. And so we have this typical picture here going on. All of this is coming to build up to the kind of crisis where we place apocalyptic literature. Where is the um, where is the question? See, if you are one of these young men from Judea and you're being put in the court of Babylon, this is the time to say, where is God? Remember when I discussed Ezekiel chapter 1, the astounding thing about chapter 1, and one of the reasons I so strongly object to those who think that chapter 1 was disarranged in the book of Ezekiel, is that the number one question that has to have been on the mind of Ezekiel as the priest in Babylon is, where is God? Can God be with us here in Babylon? And so in Ezekiel, it started by this vision. God is so mobile. He's showing up with his fast chariot with messengers going everywhere. And he comes and he shows himself to Ezekiel in Babylon. God is not limited by the territory, as has been thought through all of this time. Now here in Daniel, we have Daniel is coming up on the same sort of situation, where he is saying, he's ready to say, how does this work? And where is God in this situation? But he comes to the issue first, am I going to insist on my identity? And so that's how, that's how we carry forward. Now, the answer, and this is where Daniel becomes, how shall I say, the strong character and example that he is in all of the literature that follows, and in Christian and Jewish thought. Daniel determined not to become contaminated with the food and wine from the royal table, and begged the master of the eunuchs, this is verse 8, to excuse him from touching it. God caused the master to look on Daniel with kindness and goodwill, and to Daniel's request he replied, I'm afraid of my lord the king. He has assigned you food and drink, and if he were to see you and your companions looking miserable compared with the other young men of your own age, my head would be forfeit. Then Daniel said to the attendant, whom the master of the eunuchs had put in charge of Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and himself, submit us to this test for 10 days, give us only vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with those of the young men who have lived on the king's food, and be guided in your treatment of us by what you see for yourself. Now it's interesting here, the chief, the person in charge here, the head eunuch, is concerned with the king's reaction. I'm guessing that he is being presented here in the story as one who doesn't understand what the real issue is, because if he did understand the real issue, he would have been even more afraid for his head. He is afraid that if the young people don't eat the good food provided by the king, they're not going to be as healthy, they're not going to look as well fed, they're not going to do as well on whatever they're doing. What Daniel is doing is establishing a point of his own identity. He and his three friends will say, you're going to teach us another language, you've moved us to a new country, you've taken the implements of our temple where we worship our God and given them to your God. You've taken everything away, but we're still standing where we are. This is a point of our identity. Now, it's both a cultural thing here and it's a religious thing, because the two are so closely connected. If the chief of the eunuchs had realized that this was what Daniel was doing, I would say that doubtless the chief of the eunuchs would have said no, bar, of course, a miracle where God has him say something else. But as we see it here, he allows this particular test. Now, 10 days is hardly going to be a scientific test of diet. Interestingly enough, since Seventh-day Adventists are vegetarian, so am I still, although not by conviction, just by habit. But nonetheless, it was often presented that this vegetarian diet was just so much better. Now we have the Daniel fast, amongst Christians, and I don't have an objection to that, except to say that the vegetarianism is not in view. Daniel doesn't have an objection to eating meat. What he has is an objection that will become familiar to down the road to eating meat that has been dedicated to other gods, meat sacrificed to idols. You're going to run into it in Acts and in the various writings of Paul, a great deal to the Corinthians. And so it's an issue of defiling himself, both meat offered to idols and also meat improperly slaughtered, and meat from animals that are not acceptable to eat according to Jewish law. So by going to vegetables, instead of saying, let's eat only this list of creatures, he avoids all of these various issues by saying, okay, we're going to live on only vegetables. And as a matter of fact, probably any one of his contemporaries would have thought that he was going to become less healthy, because he's skipping all this stuff that everybody thinks is food. I've been visited a few countries where meat is almost always part of the menu, and as a vegetarian, you get this question from the waiters. Sometimes it's even direct. It's like, are you going to have any food with that meal? You're skipping the real food. Well, that's what Daniel's asking to do. He's going to skip the real food because there's all of these various hazards from his point of view. So he manages to establish his identity subtly in this way without going and saying, hey, I have this Jewish code book, and reading from Leviticus and saying, here's the foods I can eat, here's the foods I can't. Instead, he's saying, I'm going to avoid the whole thing by going on only vegetables. And with that understanding, by the way, the Daniel fast could be quite could be quite meaningful if we read carefully what's going on. It's not particularly a matter of health. Health was not the issue here. But in any case, they have a 10-day proposal, and they say you're going to compare themselves afterward and see for yourself. Verse 14, he agreed to the proposal and submitted them to this test. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who had lived on the food from the king. So the attendant took away the food assigned to them and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables only. So 10 days, they win. This is a miracle. And it's intentionally being portrayed as a miracle here. It's one of those that gives a person an anchor point that says, yes, God is still here. In the way, this result of the 10 days test tells Daniel the same thing that Ezekiel's call vision told Ezekiel. Yes, God is active here in Babylon. Yes, God is rewarding his people for being true to their identity as his people. One of the things we're going to see in Apocalyptic is a tension on this issue of identity. We always have this as God's people. There's the keeping identity, and then there is being a witness. To be a witness, you have to be in the world, you have to be seen by the world, you have to deal with people who are out and around you. The danger of all of that is that you lose the identity that is allowing you to be a witness. You become like those that you are working to change. Now, this is illustrated in Scripture again by, for example, the difference between Nehemiah, Ezra, and the books of, for example, Jonah and Ruth that are written at a similar time. Nehemiah and Ezra are strongly involved in establishing the identity of the people. Jonah and Ruth are talking about being connected to the rest of the world and that additional, being a blessing. They stand in tension, and I would strongly call that a tension, not a contradiction. What do I mean there is it's simply that Our lives and our decisions are often a tension between the having an identity, having convictions, and getting along. I think we've all met people who have such strong convictions about something that you can't live with them because they talk about nothing else. If you disagree with them on that, the only interaction you can have is on the topic, debating the topic of their conviction. So, whereas you have other people who simply blend into whatever surroundings they are. Now, two groups of people don't change the world. And what are those? They're the ones that blend into the background. They don't change the world because there's the witness doesn't occur. On the other hand, the person who is so locked up with their convictions that they can't interact with the world on any basis other than yelling about their conviction, they don't change the world either because they're just as impossible to connect with. So we put identity and connection, identity and witness, you could also say, because witness is connection, it's communication. Identity and witness, intention, because you have to find that combination that says, I am this, and because I am this, I'm going to change the world. Whatever your mission is, that's how it's going to be. And here's Daniel establishing who he is. And nonetheless, you notice he doesn't say, in order to keep my identity, I'm not going to learn your language. I'm not going to work in your court or anything like that. All he does is establish this line, this boundary that says who he is. I am God's person in this court. Understand that I see this equally strongly, whether you're treating this as a historical story, or as a work of fiction. If it's a work of fiction, it's a type saying this is the Jewish captive in the foreign land. And there were people like that. How do I know? Because there are still Jews. If there were no people like this who established those lines and said, we are the people of Israel, then there would not be a Jewish people today. The one thing that we can say for certain, or one thing, but at least one thing we can say for certain about the Jewish people is that they have learned to establish and maintain identity, as Daniel does right here. As modern Christians, we might need to learn a lot from Daniel at this point, which is that we have to find the right place in this tension between the identity and the witness. And I don't think that tension is resolved in the same way in all cases. That's why I think in Scripture it is a tension. There is not some sort of an outline of where you're supposed to be, because you're supposed to find that for yourself. As Daniel does in the court of Babylon, where he manages to maintain his identity and work. So they are going on into training. It says, to all four of these young men, God gave knowledge, understanding of books, learning of every kind, and Daniel had a gift for interpreting visions and dreams of every kind. At the time appointed by the king for introducing the young men to court, the master of the eunuchs brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them all, but found none of them to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them on any matter calling for insight and judgment, he found them 10 times superior to all the magicians and exorcists in his whole kingdom. Daniel remained there until the accession of King Cyrus. Now, this presents essentially the second miraculous situation where they're 10 times better. So God has blessed what Daniel has already done. And we've accomplished, again, this setup, getting ready for the story as it continues. Now, we immediately encounter another issue of chronology, and I'm really not going to go into it. That is, we're in the second year of his reign. King Nebuchadnezzar is troubled by dreams he had, so much so that he could not sleep. What's the problem? They're supposed to be trained for 3 years. Nebuchadnezzar took them into exile, but in the second year, we have the first incident of what they're doing. One explanation is easily that this explanation actually steps back in the story, as it clearly does to a certain extent, because chapter 1, verse 21 says Daniel remained there until the accession of King Cyrus, and this is clearly before that, but that the events of Daniel chapter 2 happened not at the end of their training, but while they were still in training, which some commentators have suggested is why Daniel is not invited. He's still a student at the point where Nebuchadnezzar has these dreams and visions. And as I'm thinking about this, I've thrown around a lot of date numbers. I'm going to go ahead and plan to put over the weekend, I'll put on my website and link from the resources page that you can find in the showcase. I'll put a chart of these dates. It's not going to straighten things out. I'm not doing a straighten things out chart. I'm simply going to put a chart of the dates so that if you actually want to read, and try to work through them, you'll have that information. Because in reciting them, it's hard for me even to be sure that I've cited all of the dates correctly. And one thing, I could even cite a date from 2 different sources that might have worked out a couple of the chronological issues differently and end up with clashing dates. It's interestingly enough, if I can hold it up here, I held up the NLT study guide. If I can hold this up with the in their introductory material. Let's see, Daniel introduction. Yeah, if I hold this up here, if you can see down there along the left, they put a chronological listing in the margin. Now, their chronological listing makes it work pretty well in there. And they're also advocating the historicity and the early dating of the book. So anyway, we go back here to the book. In the second year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, or of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar is troubled by dreams. So he gave orders for the magicians, exorcists, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to be summoned to expound to him what he had been dreaming. When they presented themselves before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream, and my mind has been troubled to know what the dream was. The Chaldeans, speaking in Aramaic, said, Long live the king. Relate the dream to us, your servants, and we shall give you the interpretation. 2 points come up here. First is they say to the king, the Chaldeans, speaking in Aramaic, said. In Hebrew, at this point, you have speaking in Aramaic, Aramith, and then the language switches. You change language right at that point in the text. So the king speaking in Aramaic, these Chaldeans speaking in Aramaic said, and what they say is in Aramaic. Now this might seem natural enough if you're in 2 languages, if you shifted back to Hebrew after their speech, but their speech only lasts, looking over here at the Hebrew text, their speech only lasts to the end of verse 4. Verse 5 goes on in Aramaic. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word that's gone forth from me is certain. So if you can't make known to me the dream and its interpretation, and explain its interpretation, then okay. So we're here down in verse 5. You're going to make known both dream and interpretation. Then you're going to be hacked limb from limb, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He gets pretty nasty at this point. So that's really quite, besides the switch here into Aramaic, which is going to stay with us now through chapter 7, through the end of chapter 7. We'll get into that in a minute. First, I want to say something, though, about this demand. This is really astonishing because his sorcerers are quite correct. No king was demanding that you tell him not only what he dreamed, you tell him what he dreamed as well as interpret it. The standard was that you related the dream and the interpreter told you what the interpretation was. So this is an astonishing sort of a request, and as the sorcerers, etc., certainly point out. Now we're going to discuss a little bit more of this matter of Aramaic, because it's one of the factors that comes into questioning the unity of the book. Literarily, people see the book as divided into chapters 1 through 6, which is kind of the stories of Daniel and his friends. 7 through 12, which is apocalyptic visions. You almost think of 7 through 12 as the apocalyptic part of the book, and 1 through 6 is more of a story, an exilic story. We have similar ones for Jews in exile. Esther would fall into that category. Judith and Tobit from the Apocrypha fall into that kind of a category of this kind of story. And 1 through 6 really falls into that. The fact that it has this short vision or the dream, which Daniel then not only interprets, but he is shown in a dream what it is that the king has dreamed. And so he comes back again and provides the interpretation. But that's the only kind of apocalyptic nature of vision. And it certainly does have a bit of an apocalyptic flavor to it in these first 6 chapters. Then 7 through 12, those are apocalyptic visions. The language, however, doesn't divide that way. 1 through 2:4a, which we've read, is done in Hebrew. 2:4b and following is in Aramaic. Through chapter 7, including the first of the big apocalyptic visions, and then chapters 8 through 12 are in Hebrew. What makes it even more complicated is that though chapter 7 would literarily be thought of as one of the final apocalyptic visions from the point of view of the overall structure of the book, it is very closely tied to the vision of the image. The empires are represented by different symbols, but nonetheless the two are closed together. I notice I'm nearly running out of time, but I would point out that I have the Q&A app active if anybody wants to ask questions or make comments. And notice, again, I'm going to remind you, I'm holding the door open on all of these interpretive elements. I'm definitely going to talk about my own view of all of this, but I simply want to point out what thinking goes into the different kind of approaches. So the king now answers, "This is my firm decision. If you do not make both dream and interpretation known to me, you'll be hacked limb from limb. Your houses will be reduced to rubble. But if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will be richly rewarded by me and loaded with honors. Tell me then the dream and its interpretation." They said again, "Let the king relate the dream to his servants, and we shall tell him the interpretation." Reasonable people, these guys. They don't really think that they should have to interpret a dream when they don't know what it is. But the king is not a reasonable man. And by the way, as a character in the literature of Daniel, the king is neither reasonable nor stable. He is repeatedly gets into trouble and has to be reconvinced. And his successors carry this on, even when it's talking Darius the Mede, who is somebody that we don't know who that might be from history, if that is historical. But even when it's a successor empire, he doesn't have that kind of stability and has to learn lessons over and over. And he's also really, really, really unreasonable. And he's demonstrating that right here. It's a firm decision. And if you don't make the dream known to me, there's but one verdict for you and one only, which is the one he's already gathered. We're going to hack you apart. We're going to destroy your house. You're done for. So, what is more, he says, continue in the middle of verse 9, you have conspired to tell me mischievous lies to my face in the hope that with time things may alter. Relate the dream to me, therefore, and then I shall know that you can give me his interpretation. In some ways that this has been translated, the implication is that Nebuchadnezzar can't remember his dream, and so the wise men and so on are going to remind him of it. But I think the better translation is what's being done here by the Revised English Version, Revised English Bible, and most modern versions, which says it's your essentially his test. He knows what he's dreamed. He wants them to tell him something he knows, but they don't, to prove that they actually have some kind of either supernatural or magical connection. So he's asking them to prove that. I shall know you that you can give me the interpretation. And now the Chaldeans again point out just how unreasonable. No one on earth can tell your majesty what you wish to know. No king, however great and powerful, has ever made such a demand of a magician, exorcist, or Chaldean. What your majesty asks is too hard. None but the gods can tell you, and they dwell remote from mortals. At this the king became furious, and in great rage he ordered all the wise men of Babylon to be put to death. A decree was issued for the execution of the wise men, and search was made for Daniel and his companions. So Daniel and his companions, who, if we're reading the chronology right, this being in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, so probably only in the second year of their education, they're like college students. And they're getting called in with all the professors to be executed because they don't know something. And they haven't even had a chance to see if they could provide an answer. But of course, who would expect that the ones who haven't graduated would do the answer? Now, one of the reasons I do think it's an intentional point here that chapter 2 makes, which is to put this within the training period, is that they're making the point of God's intervention even more firm. So, and I'm not going to read all of this, but Arioch comes to Daniel. Daniel asks him, what's going on? Why has this decree come from the king? It's not an unreasonable thing for Daniel to ask. I'm about to get executed because the king's mad at all the sorcerers, and I didn't even get to try. So Daniel went to the king, then begged to be allowed, this is verse 16, a certain time by which he would give the king the interpretation. Went home, made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's companions, saying that they should implore the God of heaven to disclose this secret in his mercy, so that they should not be put to death among the rest of the wise men of Babylon. The secret was then revealed to Daniel in a vision by night, and he blessed the God of heaven. And we then have his blessing, which I'm going to refrain from reading, although you ought to go and read it at some later time. This goes then to verse 24, and we have another roundabout as we get to the king. I'm looking at the time, and we're going to have to actually do the vision, but I want to get to the end of this introduction. The king wants to know if he can really make it known. Are you able to make known to me what I saw in my dream and then to interpret it? He's still on this point. I am only going to know that you can interpret if you can also tell me what the dream was. Daniel answered, "No wise man, exorcist, magician, or diviner can tell your majesty the secret about which you ask." In verse 28, this should be kept a good verse for all of us. "But there is in heaven a God who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what is about to be at the end of this age." Okay, this is an important point. This is showing that right from the point of view of the story, this is apocalyptic. I've commented before that apocalyptic is crisis literature. We have our crisis, and we now have the statement. We don't yet have the revelation, but we have the statement that God is able to reveal the way out and how it's going to be handled. And so I'm going to stop at that point because I've run out of time. And next week we'll start with the vision of the Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the image, chapter 2. And what that introduces. I'm going to stick with covering the story fairly clearly because I think one of our problems with a book like Daniel, and for that matter with a book like Revelation, is forgetting both the story in the book and the story that surrounds the book as we study it. In other words, we jump in here with our 21st century questions and try to extract the answers from the book when we actually are having questions from another time. And of course, in the case of Daniel, we're asking the question, are the questions that are being answered here from the 6th century, from the 4th century, from the 2nd century, or in just how is it that they're being answered? So next week, we're going to continue as we study the dream of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had, which is just kind of a foretaste of what's going to happen in chapters 7 through 12 of Daniel, passages that will probably take more time on than dealing with this. With that, thank you for joining me tonight. I enjoy working through the book of Daniel. I will probably generally be reading most of this as we discuss it. So I'll see you next week, 7 p.m. Central Time on this YouTube channel, Google Plus page as well.